Today I want to talk about how to apply risk to regulatory systems. I'm going to be talking about risk assessment and risk management, but this isn't meant to be highly technical. All of us understand risk. That's how we've managed to stay alive for so long. We know how to cross roads, we know how to drive. We take all sorts of risks, we assess them, identify them, we manage them. So we already understand a lot about risk management. So I hope that in trying to apply this to the work that you do, don't try and make it overcomplicated. Your own instincts about your understanding of risk still fit with applying it to the work that you do. And I want to try and explain how it does all fit together. What is really a wonderful privilege in working in inspections is the sort of things that you can deliver. Because regulatory systems are there to try and provide protection for the public, for the environment, for the economy, and it's you that make these regulatory systems work. Now, I'm talking about regulatory systems rather than just a whole collection of rules, because they are meant to be systems. They're meant to do things. They're meant to produce results. And you're the ones that make them work or not work. And the sort of results that they produce are things like ensuring that the water supply isn't poisoned, or ensuring that the food that you eat is safe, or the buildings that you're in are safe. It also looks after the environment, and it also deals with dishonesty, looks at consumer protection. It also protects tax revenues. It works against dishonest business practices, and it also monitors a lot of what happens in the public sector. So there is a large amount covered by a regulatory system, and it's all supposed to produce results. This isn't all that complicated because the dangers that these regulatory systems are designed to deal with are dangers that are all created by man. They're not natural disasters. There is the possibility that an asteroid could hit Belgrade, and you don't have inspections of asteroids. So there are some natural dangers, but they're not the sort of things that are dealt with in regulatory systems. Instead, we're dealing with things that we create ourselves, although it tends to be businesses that create these risks. And businesses can add risks in many ways, and I'll give you some illustrations in a moment. So that is why we inspect businesses. We try and inspect what they're doing that affects these risks to the public. And there's a very important point here, really vital point. Businesses may be the source of risks, but it's also businesses that control risks. So whether business delivers danger or safety depends on how that business is run, how well it's managed. It's businesses that provide safety, not inspectors. It's inspectors who work with businesses to ensure that there is safety. So again, repeating that point, businesses are the source of dangers, but businesses are also the source of safety if they're well managed. And your role is to deal with the ones that are badly managed and support the ones that are well managed. There are some sectors where you're dealing directly with safety of the public, and there are other sectors where you're actually protecting the public from businesses directly, like consumer protection, where you're acting against dishonest businesses. Also in tax collection, the government has to ensure a steady stream of revenue in order to provide public services. And there you can also apply risk in looking at how effectively you collect the tax revenues. You can do a risk assessment of which businesses are more likely to pay the full amount, which aren't. Risk can apply to any inspections, although it's more easily understood where you're dealing with some of the ones that more traditionally deal with safety. If you take something like food safety, now that may seem to be a natural risk because food appears to be natural, but actually food safety is a disease of urbanization. In the old days when we lived on the land, we ate an animal within a few hours of slaughter. There were still some dangers, but not nearly the number of dangers that we face today. The supply chain was very short. But as soon as we have urbanization, we have to extend the life of food. And we do that by adding preservatives or other forms of processing. We do things to the food in order to make the food last long enough to transport it, store it, distribute it, and manage to feed large cities. But each of these additional steps adds fresh dangers. And we come to demand more and more from our food. We want specialist food. We want food from the other side of the world. One of the biggest dangers is we want cheap food. And the margins in the food industry are so small that the cheaper you make the food, the more risk you add to the process in producing that cheap food, because your profit margins are so low. So the longer the supply chain, the more processing, the cheaper the eventual product, you're adding risk the whole time. So food safety is a man-made risk. And even if you think, well, the basic food products may or may not be safe, that again is down to what man has done with the food. A lot of raw materials may already be contaminated with pesticides, overuse of fertilizers. In meat, too much antibiotics or growth hormones, and heavy metals on contaminated soil. Again, all of these came from man. So all of food safety is about man-made risks. If you then look at labour safety, there are some naturally dangerous working environments, but most of the labour safety issues, again, are created by people. They're created by asking people to work in extremely dangerous situations, like building very tall buildings, where it is so easy to fall off and be killed. So there are inherently dangerous workplaces. And that is because of what we ask people to do. Even workplaces that appear to be physically safe may still be giving rise to long-term dangers from repetitive strain injury or from exposure to small dangers, poor ventilation, deafness. These things can come, and again, they're all man-made. Diseases may occur naturally, but epidemics are created by people. So you may start with a pathogen somewhere, but the spread depends on what people do. For example, in 2001 in the UK, the outbreak of foot and mouth disease was partly spread by the farmers in order to get compensation for their cattle when they were slaughtered. So even in the field of diseases, you can still get man-made risks. Businesses add risk. And that's why we have inspections to work with the businesses in how they manage the risk. Because remember what I said originally, they may add risk, but that doesn't mean to say that they get it wrong. They add the risk, is then a question of whether they control the risk and whether we can help them to control the risk. So that's trying to set the scene for why risk matters to what inspectors do. It's because all these dangers that I've tried to illustrate come from what businesses do. And if businesses do them properly, then we provide safety to the public, to the environment, and to the economy. I'll now move on to dealing with risk assessment. There are two parts to this. There are two types of risk assessment. One of them is a very technical area where we're looking at dangers in particular sectors. And this can involve a lot of complicated science, a lot of data, a lot of number crunching. That's one form of risk assessment. The other form of risk assessment is where we assess the amount of risk presented by a particular business. And the result of that is giving the business a risk rating of severe, high, moderate, low, or slight. Now that risk assessment process is different from this first risk assessment process that I'm going to cover just now. And this first one is not usually done by frontline inspectors who are going out on visits. Somebody in the inspection organisation needs to do it. And with the larger organisations, this may be done by external contractors, or may be done by academics, or may be done in other parts of government. But there are some inspectorates that don't have that amount of resource. And so for them, I'll try and explain how this sort of risk assessment is done. In order to do risk assessment of a sector, the starting point is identifying what it is we value in that sector. What things are important in the sector? And when we've identified that, we then think, right, what are the dangers to these values? What is it that might happen that will damage some of these values? And if we identify those dangers or hazards, what factors are likely to create those hazards? That then takes us into what we can start calling risk. Because risk is not the hazard itself, it's not the danger. Risk is the chances that it will actually happen. It's the probability of the hazard actually happening that is the risk. So the starting point is identifying the dangers in that sector, and the dangers are defined in terms of what we value. What is it that really matters to us in this particular sector? And from that, everything else flows. One example is labour safety. Now, in labour safety, our main value is human life and human safety. So one possible hazard is workplace accidents that cause death. One of the probabilities that this can happen is if you're working at height. So if this is a building site that is building a tall building, or has other ways that people are working on high levels, there is the risk they're going to fall and be injured or be killed. So there you've got a fairly simple bit of risk assessment, starting with the value of human life and safety, identifying a particular hazard of falling from height, and then taking that as a risk criterion, working at height. So if a business involves working at height, then that business presents a risk that in the labour safety sector needs to be dealt with. So the way risk assessment works is in 3 steps. First of all, risk identification. You need to identify which risks you need to deal with. If you get that wrong, the rest of the process doesn't matter. And as I say, you identify the risks from hazard analysis. You start with what you value, you identify what may endanger that, and then you move from risk identification to risk analysis. You analyse the nature of the damage, the potential extent of the damage, and the probability. So that gives you an analysis of how these possible hazards might actually materialise, in which case we've got a problem. But the third step is risk evaluation. We've identified there's a problem, but how big a problem? Is this a problem we need to worry about? Is this a problem that is so serious we need to take action, or is it something we can live with? So these 3 steps: identify the risk, analyse the risk, and then evaluate the risk. And at the end of that process, you'll end up with a set of problems, ones that you decided are big enough that we need to do something about them. Now this can be a highly technical, highly scientific exercise, but you don't always need to reinvent the wheel, because the dangers that you're looking at in your sector will be similar to the dangers in your sector in other countries. Other people have done the same thing. They've been through the same sort of analysis. And you can get a lot of information and a lot of help from other countries working in your sector, and a lot of help from international organisations that are concerned about these sort of things. I've been talking about labour safety. You have the International Labour Organization, ILO, that has enormous amounts of information on workplace accidents. And in terms of keeping up to date with current risks, there are international alert systems. In food, you've got something called RASFF, which is an acronym for Rapid Alert for Food Safety. And in non-food product safety, you've got RAPEX. Again, if a dangerous product is identified in one country, then the authorities put that onto the international network, and somebody in Serbia will be the contact point for RAPEX. So you get information from other countries who are also dealing with the same problem. And although this can involve a lot of complication, a lot of science, you don't necessarily need sophisticated IT systems. It's amazing what some people have done just with Excel spreadsheets. I make that point just to say it's not an excuse to avoid doing risk assessment because you don't have the IT. There's a lot of risk assessment you can do without sophisticated IT, and what you need more than good IT is just having a good brain. And risk is also something that is a moving target. So risk assessment is a continuous process because risk keeps changing over time, over place. You need to keep checking your risk assessment again because things change. For example, if you're looking at changes in the economy, these can have a big impact on your sector. And this can apply probably whatever sector you're in, but as an example, take construction. If there's a lot of business confidence, there's a boom, things are moving forward, the economy is picking up, people start building. Investors see the possibility of good returns for a new shopping centre. They get the money, they start the work, they dig the hole, they start putting up the building, and then the economy changes. You get a downturn. There's less money. There's less money for that business. So what does it do? It started the building. Its success is going to depend on completing the building. This is really quite dangerous. And this is something that the construction sector inspection should always be looking out for. Changes in the economy will have a knock-on effect through to how businesses perform. Just now in Serbia, we're experiencing a lot of migration of people from outside the EU to other places in the EU. Serbia may not have quite the same impact as some other countries, but it is still having an effect, which is new and which hopefully is temporary. But again, in your sector, you need to think, well, how might that be affecting the risks in the sector that I work in? Sometimes risks change simply because we get better information. Things that we thought weren't a problem before, we suddenly realize they are a problem. Sometimes better science reveals new dangers as well as new ways of dealing with them. Also, urban risks and rural risks can be very different. Things that can be dealt with safely in the countryside may not be so easy to deal with in an urban situation. And so there can be different ways of dealing with the same risks depending on where you are. So risk needs to have constant reassessment. And even if it was a bit more stable, risk also varies according to who is going to be affected. So you can have exactly the same risk in an office building or in a hospital, but the impact is going to be different because of the vulnerability of the people in a hospital as opposed to the people in an office. So places like hospitals, kindergartens, places looking after old people, disabled people, these change the level of risk. Even although the circumstances apart from these people are no different. So risk does involve constant updating. And the final part of this section is looking at how all these risk assessments eventually come together in the checklist. And the checklist is applying risk to law. The law gives you all the regulations, all the things that the businesses are supposed to comply with, but all laws are equal, or pretty well equal. But if you're looking at real dangers and looking at real results, then not all the factors are equal. Some are more dangerous than others. So what the checklist does is it takes all the different regulations that apply and it ranks them according to the impact that they have on the risks being managed. They also simplify the law. They also make it easier to work with the business because instead of having to understand a huge complex mass of laws and regulations and norms, you have this one checklist. And that is the area of inspection, that's the area of discussion between the business and the inspector. So in this way, you can have better communication with the business, and in fact the business itself can handle its risk more effectively. And I want to move on to part 3 on how you provide risk ratings for businesses. And this idea of rating businesses is very common now. If you go onto Amazon or TripAdvisor, then you'll see businesses rated. So this can apply also with inspections. And businesses are assessed according to the level of risk they present. And this is probably the most technical that I'm going to get in terms of a formula. Risk here is the combination of the magnitude of harm and the likelihood of it happening. The magnitude of harm is a combination of the nature of the danger and the extent of the damage. And the likelihood of it happening comes from the performance of the business. So first of all, the nature of the danger. Risk assessment is not a moral judgment. A high-risk business is not necessarily a bad business. We need high-risk businesses. Nuclear power stations will always be high risk, but some countries need them. So the materials used in the process may be dangerous. If you're making explosives, that will always be high risk. But meat and milk are also high risk. Construction projects add risk through process. The basic materials may be safe, but when you start hauling them up to the 32nd floor, then they become dangerous. The extent of the damage is another important factor. Bottled water is a high-risk product, not because of water being dangerous, or even the process of bottling being dangerous, but simply the number of people who could be affected. So if something goes wrong in a water bottling plant, then that can affect tens of thousands of people. Street traders may attract a lot of attention. They may be quite risky in the food they supply, but they don't affect all that many people. And if this is a state inspection, then you're concerned about large numbers of people and not small numbers. The likelihood of the damage comes from the performance of the business. How well is it managed? Does it have safety management systems in place? And what is its history of compliance? So these factors are added together and they combine to give an overall score for a business. That can then be converted into an overall risk rating depending on how high the number is. So the assessment of a business is something that is done by the frontline inspector. The technical stuff has been done before then in drawing up the checklist that the inspector uses in order to give the risk rating to the business. That checklist identifies the things that the inspector needs to look for, and each of these factors gets a particular weighting because not all things are equally important. And the inspector's job is to apply that checklist to what he or she finds in the business. So for the frontline inspector, this is not a highly technical exercise. What is technical is making up that checklist in the first place. There can also be specialist risk assessment cases for types of building for fire safety, or locations of buildings on floodplains, land erosion areas. This can get very complex, and for large organisations this will be done not by frontline inspectors but by other parts of the organisation. The final bit in this section is looking at learning and adapting. I've mentioned that risk is going to change over time, over place, over the sort of people you're dealing with. So risk is dynamic. But also the law itself has to be applied in practice, and it will depend on what you find. There always has to be room for some level of discretion on the part of inspectors, because you can't predict everything, and the law can't predict everything. So it has to be adjusted to take care of what you actually find in your experience. But that experience then builds into an enormous amount of extremely valuable data. One of the biggest benefits of risk-based inspection is how much you learn about the sector after you've been applying it for a few years. In a sense, all these inspections are like an enormous, highly detailed survey of businesses, which produces a huge amount of data. When you then look at that data, you can spot trends. You can see where the dangers are, which may not always be where you thought they were. You can see how these trends are changing, maybe across time, maybe in different parts of the country. You can also see anomalies that really stand out, and you need to think, is there something special about that place? Or did they just get it wrong? So the amount of data that you bring back completely changes how you can do the job. The level of self-awareness that an inspection agency can get from gathering all that information from all these inspections can become one of the most valuable resources that it has. I was talking earlier about risk assessment, and this is all about how to gather a collection of problems, identifying risks, assessing risks, evaluating them, so that the end product is we've got a pile of problems. Risk management is how we solve these problems. I said at the start, this is not complicated, and instinctively we know how to deal with this. And I want to try and explain how we normally manage risks in our everyday lives, and then how to apply that to the work of an inspection oversight body. So let's start with the analogy of crossing town by car in order to get to a meeting. There are risks that you'll not get to the meeting on time, there are risks you'll damage the car, there are even risks you might get killed. So one way of dealing with all these risks is to avoid them, just by not going. But that defeats the purpose. So another way of dealing with all these risks is to reduce them. You can reduce the risk by going at a quieter time when there's less traffic on the road and you've got a better chance of getting there on time. Or you can share the risk or transfer the risk. The risk of financial damage to your car, if you have an accident, you can transfer to an insurance company with motor insurance. The risk of making a mistake when you're driving or damaging your own car, you can transfer to a taxi. You take a taxi and you've transferred a lot of your risk to the taxi. You're still sharing a risk with the taxi of having an accident, and you're still sharing the risk of not getting there on time. And another way you can deal with it is simply to accept the risk. You decide you're going to go. Now, nothing's changed. You just decide the risk is acceptable, I'm going to go. But you probably have a plan B. So you'll probably take the phone number of the person that you're going to meet, just in case you don't get there on time. So the 4 classic ways of managing risks are avoid, reduce, share or transfer, or accept. This may seem too simple, but think about it yourselves as you go about your daily business and see if you can think of any other categories, because the experts on risk have generally come to these 4 as the main ways of managing risk. So how do we then apply these 4 to the work of an oversight body? The oversight body is responsible for delivering a regulatory system. It's responsible for delivering safety to people, to the environment, to the economy, to state revenues. And it has identified an awful lot of dangers that it needs to manage in that process. So, how does it then apply these 4 classic risk treatment strategies to its work? First one is avoid. Now, unlike the analogy where we just don't go across town, an inspection oversight body can't avoid the really big dangers by doing nothing. It, in fact, has to do the opposite. So there are some dangers that are so extreme that we must ensure they do not happen. That is what avoid means there. So some activities or some products are so dangerous, there is a complete ban in the law on owning that product or conducting that activity. For inspection, we ensure that these things are stopped or these things don't happen. That is one of the responses of a regulatory system to a very dangerous risk. Avoid the risk happening. Ensure that it is stopped or prevented. But there are many other dangers that simply need to be managed or reduced. So there are some products or activities that are safe in some circumstances and dangerous in others. So some activities are perfectly safe for adults, but dangerous for children. Some food ingredients are fine in small doses, but will kill you if you have too much. And this is where an awful lot of skilled inspection comes in trying to adapt the law for the circumstances you find. This is still reducing the risks of the dangers without total avoidance. It's managing the risks through reduction. But you can also share a lot of risks with other people. And you should always look out for any other organizations that are trying to do the same thing that you are, and see how much you can join up. One example is from the Netherlands and the area of fire safety. Now in the Netherlands, they realised that most buildings, once they catch fire, burn to the ground, and there's not an awful lot you can do about it. Their main priority is to save lives, not to save buildings. So the Dutch fire service decided what it would check is just evacuation. It's not going to check how to avoid the building going on fire or check all the ways of trying to preserve the building if it does go on fire, because it knows that the insurance companies are going to send in their inspectors to check these things. So what matters to the Dutch fire service is getting people out, not saving the building. That is up to inspectors from the insurance companies. In food production, a lot of big retail outlets have their own controls on their suppliers. And these controls are often far more strict than the law requires in terms of food safety. Always look around in your sector to see if there are other people doing the same sort of job as you, and how you can join forces with them. And you can also share a lot of the risks simply by working in partnership with the businesses. Remember I said at the start, businesses are the source of risks, but they can also be where you control the risks. So businesses can deliver safety as well as deliver danger. And your job can be to work in partnership with businesses that are trying to get the right results and help them get the right results. Inspection oversight bodies can also work in partnership with consumers. Sometimes this can be extremely effective if you have the respect of consumers and their trust. Then the advice that you give can affect what they choose to buy. And that can put pressure on businesses as well. So you can work with businesses, you can work with consumers. You can go beyond just inspection. If the overall responsibility of the oversight body is to protect the public from these various dangers, then it doesn't have to look only at inspections in delivering that. Now, the fourth risk treatment strategy is accept. And this is an important one as well. If you are applying risk, then you tend to focus on high risk issues. And that's right. That is where you need to pay attention. But the opposite end is you've also identified what is low risk. And that low risk ought to fall off the end. So you should be looking at which risks are acceptable. Which risks you do not need to spend state resources on. And so you should consciously set limits on when you're going to get involved and when you're not. There are some inspection organisations that will say if the probability of an accident is 1 in 10 million people in a year, then that is not a risk worth worrying about, and not a risk worth putting state resource into. In analysing your sector and looking at the resources you have, it is an important decision to decide what you're not going to do as well as what you are going to do. And it may be useful to explain that to the public as well. Because one of the dangers in trying to proactively manage a regulatory system is being thrown off course by responding to random complaints from the public. A lot of complaints from the public will be low-level, low-risk issues that matter a lot to the person complaining, but don't really deserve to have state resources in responding. So it is important to work out your lower limits as well as the upper limits. And the other part of the accept strategy is plan B. It's having a contingency plan. Sometimes you accept the risk as a matter of postponing the risk management. So sometimes, in fact, the risk may be very high, a big danger, but there's nothing you can do about it in advance. And what you should be doing, rather than trying to prevent it, is be ready for it if it happens. So some risks are more suitable for contingency planning than for trying to manage more proactively. Something like an animal disease outbreak. These things happen every now and again, and there are some things you can do to reduce the risk, but you can never exclude the risk. And so what you need to do is to have a contingency plan for how you're going to handle that outbreak if it happens and when it happens. Now you can apply these categories of avoid, reduce, share, accept across a lot of different sectors. Some simple examples. If you take food safety, the big dangers you need to avoid in whatever circumstances are poison, contamination from disease, cooking in dirty conditions, But then under reduce, you've got a lot of measures that can be taken to manage these risks, like good temperature control, making sure that hot food is kept hot enough, cold food is kept below a particular temperature. Traceability of food supply is an enormous help if something goes wrong and you have to try and stop the outbreak spreading further and get the food back in. Sharing risk in terms of food safety is where you help businesses develop food safety management systems. And under accept, again, you should have contingency plans for how to deal with an outbreak of food illness. If you look at labour safety, you must avoid broken equipment or untrained staff doing dangerous work. But you can also reduce the risks of workplace accidents with protective equipment, harnesses, risk assessment of the workplace, training. You can share risk management of labour safety by working with labour safety consultants. The ILO suggests that the oversight bodies should produce guidance rather than training. Guidance sets out better ways of ensuring safety, but if you provide training as well, then there's a potential of conflict of interest if you trained a company and then you go and inspect them. So instead you can work in partnership with the private sector who supply consultants in labour safety. And in labour safety, the fourth strategy, accept, is particularly important. Because there, in labour safety, you always have to strike a balance between safety and cost. You can never have perfect safety because it would be too expensive. And one of the common standards for tolerability of risk in labour safety is as far as is reasonably practicable. So this is something which has been developed over the years in the labour safety area in order to strike that balance. So in different sectors, you can have different examples of how to apply these four categories. What I now want to talk about is risk sharing with businesses, because it's businesses that manage the risks, whether successfully or not. And it is important that you understand the economics of the business that you're dealing with. The most dangerous businesses are the ones that are barely viable economically. Because when things are difficult commercially, then one of the corners they cut is safety. Businesses that are successful tend to be safer. And you need to adjust your enforcement according to the economic circumstances of the business. And Article 25 of the law makes that a responsibility. How you deal with businesses depends a lot on the attitude of the business. There is a classification of businesses that is used in enforcement agencies across the world called responsive regulation. And businesses are classified as those that are criminal, those that are opportunist, those that are willing to comply but not yet compliant, and the fourth category is those that are already compliant. So these four categories require different strategies to deal with them. And we also have what's called the enforcement pyramid, where you can escalate the action that you take to try and ensure compliance. You can start off with light touch actions, and you can build up to penalties, closing down the business, even criminal prosecutions. And that will depend largely on the attitude of the business. It is important to understand these distinctions between those that are already compliant, where there's not a lot more to do, those who are opportunistic, where there's not a lot you can do with them either. The ones that are criminal, yes, there's action you can take, but where the most effective use of regulatory resources comes is that area of businesses that are willing to comply but are not yet compliant. Now this leads to a very important distinction in how inspection oversight bodies operate. The traditional approach is to reduce non-compliance. It's about catching bad guys. And it's similar to policing. This is well known, this is what the public expect, this is what politicians expect, but in terms of delivering overall levels of safety, very often it is statistically insignificant that you get rid of some bad businesses. What matters far more is building up the large numbers of compliant businesses. It's the compliant businesses, those that manage the risk safely, that deliver the results. If the majority of businesses are criminals, you've got a bigger problem than just how to have a good inspection system. In the vast majority of countries, most businesses are willing to comply. It depends on the costs of compliance, and this can be quite a complicated business, but the main task of a modern inspection oversight body is to increase the numbers of those that are willing to comply until they're compliant. You will still need to catch a few bad guys because the politicians demand that, the public demands that, and the compliant businesses want to see that happening as well. So you need to put resource into reducing non-compliance and dealing with the bad guys. But that shouldn't be the majority of the resource, because that is not where you eventually deliver safety. You deliver safety from the large number of businesses that become compliant. And they can involve different techniques, because if you're wanting to increase compliance, you need to find out what are the barriers to compliance in the first place. Why is it that they're not compliant? And in some countries that we've worked in, we find that the main reason is ignorance. It's not they don't want to comply, it's nothing to do with principle, it's they don't understand what they're required to do. Or the law is ambiguous, or they're caught between conflicting laws. If that's the problem, then you can deal with it relatively easily for a very large number of businesses. So sometimes dealing with the barriers to compliance can be far more cost effective than individual inspections trying to catch bad guys. Another common reason for non-compliance is lack of capacity. The business doesn't have the skills, or it doesn't have the staff. It may be a rural business that simply can't get the staff. Or it may be compliance costs. It's too expensive for that business to meet the compliance costs. Now that may just be that the business thinks it's too expensive because it doesn't really understand what it needs to do to comply. Inspectors can be an enormous source of valuable advice and information because they've seen so many other businesses and they've seen how they've managed the same problems. So sometimes you can help a business manage its compliance costs in ways that hadn't occurred to it. But another factor in non-compliance is competitive advantage. I am only going to bear the compliance costs if I know that all my competitors are also bearing the same costs. Now this is a direct responsibility for the inspection oversight body. It is up to you to give businesses confidence that everyone in their sector is being treated fairly and equally. And this is very important in terms of economic growth as well. When a business is making the difficult decision on whether to expand, which is needed to grow the economy, then a major factor is in having confidence that the regulatory environment that it's working in will be fair and equal. and that is up to you. So, understanding the barriers to compliance involves different techniques to just inspection and can provide solutions that can affect a very large number of businesses without having individual inspections. The final part of this talk is about that fourth category of accept, of tolerating risks. And I mentioned before that it is important to set the lower levels because of the importance of dealing with complaints. Right at the start I mentioned that regulatory systems are systems. There are systems that are supposed to work, they're supposed to deliver results. They're not just collections of rules. And the inspection oversight body is responsible for making that system work. And it can do that if it can plan ahead. It knows the people it's dealing with, it knows the businesses, it understands the sector, so there is a lot that is predictable, a lot that can be planned. So you get an annual plan of inspections which are targeting the high-risk businesses, and you also get monitoring plans and surveillance plans. There's a lot that can be planned. What can destroy the whole lot is by responding to complaints. And there are some countries where they say they've got a risk-based system, but they actually have a complaints-based system because 80% of the inspections are responding to complaints and not according to the plan. It can be very difficult how to manage complaints because there is a responsibility to respond in some way. But the response does not always have to be an inspection. So there have to be ways of managing complaints, and part of that is to set the lower limits and to make it clear to the public that some dangers, although they may matter to an individual, are not important enough for the state to spend resources on dealing with. And the other part of tolerability of risk is contingency planning. And it's this idea of deciding to defer action until the risk materializes and to have a contingency plan for what to do when it happens. This is a very important part of risk management. There was a time that I was working in Nigeria in a Sharia state, and one of the imams told me that all this risk management stuff that I was teaching people was haram. It was sacrilege. Because in the Quran there is a verse that says, only Allah knows what tomorrow will bring. And it is not for man to try and predict the future or manage the future. And everything I was saying about risk management looked awfully like trying to manage the future. And his response was, Inshallah. Whatever God wills, that is what will be. And it is up to man to accept God's will and deal with it. Or as my daughter recently said to me, Dad, get over it. This is a valid risk management strategy. That instead of trying to control the future and put a lot of resource into managing how the future is going to turn out, sometimes it is better to simply be ready for the future. And whatever comes up, you have your plan for dealing with it. Some risks this doesn't work with. If the risk is going to be something that will kill you, then you can't just cover that with a contingency plan. But sometimes a lot of resources wasted in trying to manage the future rather than prepare for it. So what I've tried to cover in this talk is going beyond just inspections. It's the oversight body looking across the whole sector, looking at the range of dangers that have been identified, and looking at the range of responses, including inspection, but not just inspection, in how to manage these risks and deliver safety for people, for animals, for the environment, for the economy, and for the revenues of the state. Thank you.